This is Environmental Science 1, Chapter 3, How Ecosystems Work. In this portion of the video lecture, we will be discussing energy flow in ecosystems, as well as the cycling of materials through the ecosystem. For life on the surface of the Earth, life really does depend on the sun. Without sunlight, there would be no plants. With no plants, we would have no herbivores, and with no herbivores, we would have no carnivores. In the cases of ecosystems that are in places where there is no sunlight, for example, cave ecosystems, or perhaps deep ocean ecosystems near hydrothermal vents, those organisms will chemosynthesize as opposed to photosynthesize. So in chemosynthesis, organisms take chemicals out of their environment and switch them around to make a food source, much like plants do with sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water through photosynthesis. So all life depends on the sun if it lives on the surface of the Earth, and if not, it depends on geochemical processes. Remember, all organisms can be broken up into two groups based on how they obtain energy. Autotrophs, or sometimes they're called producers. These are the self-energy makers. So plants, blue-green algae, if they photosynthesize or chemosynthesize, they are an autotroph. Heterotrophs, hetero means other, so these are consumers. So heterotrophs are anything other than plants or blue-green algae. So heterotrophs are consumers. So herbivores, of course, these are the producers. Herbivores are our plant eaters. Carnivores, these are consumers, of course, and they are exclusive meat eaters. And the old omnivores, remember omni in Latin means all. So omnivores will eat both producers and consumers. And detritivores, sometimes they're called scavengers. Detritus in Latin means garbage or waste. So detritivores are kind of like the janitors of the ecosystem. They clean up the dead organic material. In order for consumers to get their energy, they have to perform cellular respiration. So this is how we break down food to get energy, or ATP, for the cell. Energy for living things is all of our daily activities, growth, development, adaptations, all of those characteristics of life that we know and learned from biology. Energy transfers through the ecosystem. When something gets consumed, that food energy will follow several paths through the organism. So once an organism eats something or ingests it, it will begin to digest. The digestion process will start to break up that food into energy, and that energy can go in a couple of different ways. That energy can be excreted out. That energy would be available to detritivores or scavengers. The energy for cellular respiration, that energy is used to perform work in the animal, so cellular activities, its daily life, growth, development, all those characteristics of life is respiration. That energy is no longer available to the consumer because it's being used by the organism itself. Energy can also go into growth and reproduction. That is the energy that is available to consumers. And eventually that organism will die, which can also be energy available for detritivores. So types of energy, we have what's called assimilated energy. Assimilated energy in an organism supports the general maintenance of that organism, growth, development, etc. Respired energy, that's the energy that is used to build the organism's tissues. The assimilated energy is not available to a consumer, whereas the respired energy is available to the consumer. There's a couple of different ways we can look at how food transfers and how energy transfers through the ecosystem. We can take a look at food chains versus food webs. A food chain is a very simple sequence of energy relationships. It's one example in the ecosystem of who could eat whom. A food web, on the other hand, is a little more realistic of an ecosystem. It's many connected food chains together. So food webs show all of the possibilities of who can eat whom in the ecosystem, whereas a food chain only shows one of those sequences. Ecologists can study both. They may study a food chain if there's a particular relationship between an organism and another that they're looking at, or they can study the whole food web to see how relationships interconnect. So a food chain, again, is a very simple sequence. So we have the grasshopper, the frog eats the grasshopper, snake eats the frog, hawk eats the snake. It's very leveled from down all the way up. A food web, on the other hand, again, this is a better picture of what really goes on in an ecosystem. Not to say that in any given day, these consumers actually consume all of these different organisms, but they could. And so a food web really shows everybody's relationship in the community. So trophic levels is how we take a look at energy transfers, because troph in Latin means energy. So when energy is transferred from one organism to another, less of it is available to organisms at the next level. So 90% of energy is that assimilated energy. It's used by the organism for life functions. Only 10% of that respired energy is stored and available to an organism that would consume it from the next trophic level. So trophic energy works like a pyramid. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we have our producers, or our autotrophs. And then the next level up, we have the herbivores, or the primary consumers. They're called primary because they only eat the producers. The next level up, we would have what's called secondary consumers. Secondary consumers can be carnivores. They can also be omnivores, or detritivores are also considered secondary consumers because bacteria will eat anything, plant or animal. And then at the very top level, we have tertiary consumers. Kind of think of tertiary consumers as the top of the food chain. So these would be carnivores and omnivores as well. So it's set up like a pyramid, and just like a pyramid can't be wobbly, it has to have a big, fat, steady base. So we have to have a lot of producers to support the rest of the ecosystem. So there's always fewer organisms at higher trophic levels. Why is this? Well, because there's a decreased amount of energy available at the top levels. Remember, only 10% of that respired energy from an organism is available to something that eats it. The further you are on top of the ecological pyramid, the energy pyramid, the more you have to consume. So there has to be more members at the bottom of the pyramid than the top to make it stable. If there's not enough energy at those bottom levels, the upper levels can't be supported. If there aren't enough producers or autotrophs for the herbivores or primary consumers to nibble on, there won't be enough of those to go around for our secondary or tertiary consumers to nibble on. So producers really make and set up the health of the ecosystem. Taking a look at how different important elements cycle through the ecosystem. Mother Nature and the earth itself is a great recycler. So materials are continuously being used and reused. Water, of course, is very important on our planet as well as important to living things. So the water cycle is how water goes from the earth to the atmosphere and back again. And as usual, we have the sun driving the water cycle as well. So evaporation is where we go from liquid to a gas, condensation going from gas to a liquid, and then we get precipitation when it gets heavy enough to fall down. So solar energy provides that energy to drive the water cycle. So water will evaporate and then eventually cool and fall as precipitation. Once it does that, precipitation can either evaporate right away, it can run off into rivers, lakes, or oceans, it can be absorbed up by the plants, or it can form groundwater. And the process continues. It can be evaporated and condensed and precipitated, etc. The carbon cycle. Carbon is very important to living organisms because we are carbon-based life forms. So on land, carbon gets switched around back and forth between photosynthesis and respiration. And then, of course, we also have that humid added activity of fossil fuel burning. That's putting a little extra carbon up into the atmosphere. For aquatic ecosystems, carbon dioxide and oxygen can dissolve fairly easily in water. So photosynthesis and respiration can take place underwater as well. So taking a look at how carbon can cycle through and where the carbon comes from, we can see in this diagram here, we have the flip-flop back and forth of carbon between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, and of course that added fossil fuel combustion from human activities. The nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is very important to living things as well. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are the only little organisms that can absorb nitrogen directly out of the air. If it wasn't for nitrogen-fixing bacteria, plants would not be able to receive the nitrogen that they need through their root system in order to grow, because these little nitrogen-fixing bacteria attach onto the roots of the plant, and they can take nitrogen directly out of the air and give that to the plant. It's a very mutualistic relationship. So then herbivores come by and nibble on the plant, and they get their nitrogen that way. Carnivore comes by and nibbles on little herbivore to get their nitrogen that way, and once everything dies, those detritivores will get their nitrogen from the dead organic material. And this can also happen in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. This diagram here is kind of an example of a terrestrial or land ecosystem. Again, those nitrogen-fixing bacteria take it out of the atmosphere, give it to plants. The plants give it to the animals and the plants give it back to the detritivores or scavengers to consume. And the cycle continues. So this has been Environmental Science 1, Chapter 3 on how ecosystems work.